What's going on, everybody? This is Nick Cullen Carroll coming to you from Southern California, and today I have a short presentation for you all on periodization and program design, and we're going to look at where does velocity-based training fit into the equation. I'm going to start you off with an inspirational quote from one of my favorite coaches, John Wooden. He said this in a speech in 1977 to the Texas Tech University. He said, "When you fail to prepare, you are preparing to fail." And I think this has major implications for the topic that we're about to talk about, because we've seen some studies, we've seen some successful sports teams that have progressed because they had a set plan. So here's our outline for the day. We're going to talk about the expectations. We're going to just briefly introduce the topic, give you some definitions, give you some nice little tables and charts, because I know everybody learns differently, so I want to be able to portray that in different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about the supercompensation theory, which is one of the main theories that periodization was started off of. We'll look at some of the structure of periodization, and then we'll break down some of the stuff that's going to be in your discussion questions this week. So we're going to go back through kind of a mini introduction when we get to linear, nonlinear, and block models, because I want to be as thorough as possible for everyone. Then we're going to go over 3 studies, one of which is a velocity-based study, and the other 2 which are going to be comparing different types of models. So here's our expectations, our outcomes. I want you all to be able to describe linear and nonlinear periodization. I want you to be able to highlight the similar or dissimilar effects from different models, particularly linear, undulating, and block. The undulating is going to be that nonlinear model. I want you to demonstrate the responses in trained, untrained, athletic, and general populations. And then the last one's going to be your big cognitive question. I want you to evaluate where velocity-based training fits into the program design puzzle. I really want to hear what you guys have to say about this. You know, is it something as extreme as velocity-based training can take over for all of periodization? Or is it simply just going to be a feedback tool, just like verbal cues from a coach? Or somewhere in between? So let's start with some basic definitions. We have periodization, which, according to Isserin, is the purposeful sequencing of different training units, long, medium, short, cycles, as well as sessions. And this is for athletes to attain a desired state and a planned result, right? I want to peak at X date, and I want to be as strong as possible. Then we have program design, which is manipulated variables to produce biological adaptations through 3 of our primary principles. If you guys remember these, specificity, right? We have specific goals that we want to achieve with our plan. Overload, we want to continuously produce increased effects. And then we want to progress, right? We need progression in our program in order to avoid accommodation or being stale. So these variables, they're pretty in-depth. I think they can get more in-depth based on the source that you look at, but this is all coming from the NSCA Essentials textbook. Dr. Half said that these variables are needs analysis, so our goals, our exercise selection, as well as our exercise order, our training frequency, so our days per week, our days per month, maybe days per year if you want to be that in-depth, our intensity, which, just a little precursor here, we're talking about percentages there, but we could be talking about velocity being our intensity in the future. Who knows? Then we have volume, which can be broken down to repetitions and sets. And then we have rest, which could be inter-repetition, inter-set rest, between exercises, between workouts, between days. Obviously, you guys know all this stuff. So over here on the right side, this is one of my favorite models. This is the classic periodization model by Medvedev from back in the 50s, 60s, whenever he was a weightlifting coach and a sports scientist for the Soviet Union. We can see that we have an increase in intensity and technique over time towards that competition phase, which should result in a subsequent decrease of volume training, or actually a simultaneous decrease in volume, All right, so our primary theory for where this stuff originally came from is the one-factor theory, also known as supercompensation. This is from the Isserin article that I'm going to list for you guys. You can also see a little more depth on this topic in the Zatsiorsky book, Science and Practice of Strength Training. He goes into a 1 theory and a 2 theory factor model, but I want to keep this very plain, very basic. If you want to look into that stuff, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll send you some more resources. But this was kind of based on biological compounds. So they did a lot of studies here with the one factor theory based on glucose depletion and phosphocreatine, creatine phosphate depletion, ATP depletion. And they looked at, acute studies when you applied a load, how much did it deplete, what was the fatigue recovery phase, and then did it increase above the normal biological amount that it was prior to the load. And then it goes a little bit further when you get into some of the two-factor theories talking about how long do you have that emphasized fitness or that super compensation where you need to do another workout to take advantage of that and continue building or progressing, right? Continue overloading on top of that super compensated biological compound. It goes back even further than that to Cellier's general adaptation syndrome, right? So a little more structure to this. Periodization is broken down typically into different types of cycles, and then I just want to thresh out all the nomenclature for you guys. So we have a workout, which is a single training session, right? A microcycle, which can be a series of days. Usually we talk about a microcycle as a week, up to 2 weeks sometimes if you're talking about block periodization. Then you have mesocycles, which is where most coaches lay a lot of their planning emphasis on. I see a lot of coaches that prefer to program in 3 to 4 week blocks. I prefer to program in 5 to 6 week blocks, and I like to keep my pre and post testing as a part of that block, just so I know the total amount of volume I'm doing, even with my testing, and if I'm actually progressing towards my goals. Not that other coaches don't do that. I just see that more as a 6 week rather than a 3 to 4 week. Then you have macrocycles, which is months. I like to call macrocycles seasons because you typically have a prep phase, a comp phase, and a transition phase. And then you have multi-year preparation, which is usually the 4-year cycle for the Olympics, right? But you also have 2-year cycles for world championships and things like that. It just depends on the type of athlete you're working with. A lot of times you only see the 4-year cycles in elite athletes. For example, anything in the Olympics, right? Let's say weightlifting, for example, you might have them on a 4-year cycle training through national and international competitions, and you just want them to really peak and have the biggest super compensation, we'll say, at that Olympics after 4 years. However, I think there should be more emphasis in youth populations for multi-year models because, you have all of elementary school PE, for example, you have all of high school PE and sports. You have college, which can be 2 to 4 year cycles. It should be at least. But I don't see a lot of emphasis there. So let's look at some macrocycles. All right, what we have here are a series of 3 different macrocycles. We have one with a single peak in a season. We have one with a double peak. And then we have the bottom model with a triple peak during the course of a season. So these are pretty much broken up into blocks, and we'll look a little bit more at what block periodization is here. You have a prep phase where you're doing the majority of your work. Then you have the competition phase where the workload maybe comes down, but the intensity and the technique, like we mentioned, starts to become the primary focus, and we're hoping that we're at 100% at that point. And then we come back down, maybe even below what our prep phase was, into the transition phase. And you could see how that changes. It adds a little bit more work in, and it becomes a subsequent increase when you add more models, right? You may not be at 100% in the first peak, but you want to be 100% in the last peak, and then that becomes a little bit lower in the first peak of a triple peak cycle, progressively increasing towards your big peak at the end of the season. So let's look at some definitions for the types of models that we're going to be writing about this week. We have the linear model, which is a classic model introduced by Medvedev. It was also adapted by Stone, and it's based on changing the exercise and the exercise volume and intensity across several mesocycles, but it kind of has that linear increase like we mentioned. This will be the 3rd time I mentioned it, I'm sorry, but you have the increase in intensity and the decrease in volume. It's pretty basic. It's kind of made around those 2 characteristics or those 2 program design variables. Then you have the non-linear approach, which is based on the concept that intensity and volume are adjusted more frequently. You're going to see the word undulated thrown in here. Undulated is the nonlinear model. Okay, so you have daily undulation, weekly undulation, you have biweekly undulation. And this is to allow for more recovery periods, but also it's to allow for the training of multiple goals. So a linear or classical model, you might have one or two goals, probably going to have one. When it comes to the nonlinear model, you're trying to train multiple goals at once. The comparison I like to make is maybe a single event athlete in track and field might be on a linear model, a weightlifter might be on a linear model, and then you have somebody on a nonlinear model playing sports like basketball, volleyball, somebody who needs a different array of motor abilities throughout the course of the season. They can't really just be focusing on one thing at one time. Then you have block training, which kind of furthers the concept of an undulating type phase or an undulating type model, but it's slightly different, and we'll go over some physical representations of that. So block training is a training cycle of highly specialized workloads. You have a large volume of exercises that are going to be directed at a minimal number of targeted abilities, and it has three specific phases in there: an accumulation, a transmutation, and a realization. Similar to a pre-comp, a comp, and a transition, you have an accumulation, which is kind of a general training phase, a transmutation, which is a specific training phase, and then realization, which is a peak. So let's take a look at a couple of these different illustrations of what these types of models look like. At the top, we have three different models. The very top of the table 4, we have the linear group. So we can see a decrease in volume over time, right? Weeks 1 to 3, 3 sets of 8, 4 to 6, 3 sets of 6, 7 to 9, 3 sets of 4. The next group below that is the daily undulating group. As you could imagine, volume changes every day. So for the course of that 9-week program, they have 3 sets of 8 on Monday, 3 sets of 6 on Wednesday, and 3 sets of 4 on Friday. Then for the weekly undulating, as you can imagine, they change volumes every week, right? Week 1, 3 sets of 8. Week 2, 3 sets of 6. Week 3, 3 sets of 4. And then it comes back and it repeats twice, right? So week 4, 3 sets of 8. Week 5, 3 sets of 6. Goes back. For our block model, you could see that in table 1 at the bottom of our slide here. Okay? And we're going to be cycling through the specific focused motor abilities, but we're going to have a similar progression to the linear model, right? So we get that mixed motor ability feeling, but we also get the linear progressing feeling. Okay, so you could see strength endurance is what the block starts off emphasizing, moves to strength, and then it moves to power. So again, see that as the general phase, right? They're training for strength and endurance to build a nice platform. Then they're building upon that and transferring it into strength. And then they're really peaking and transferring it into power. And by the end of that model, you can see we start with 3 sets of 10 and we move down to 1 set, 3 set of 3. The other piece to this puzzle that you can see is the program design of the intensity. So based on the days, they have either a light, which is the L, a moderate, which is the M, or a heavy day, and then in between as well, right? So you might have a very light day, you might have a very heavy day, you might have a moderate to light day, you might have a moderate to heavy day. And this is all based on what position in the block that you're in. Let's look at a couple comparisons here. So actually, the last slide that we just looked at, all those tables were from these studies we're going to look at. So it's nice, we'll have a little similarity here. That first table we looked at, comparing linear to daily undulating and weekly undulating, we have the results. That was a study by Buford et al., and they did 9 weeks of training, and they had 3 time periods for which they tested. And if you look at the progression of the training in the paper, you could see, I mean, it makes sense, the results being similar. They equated the volume, so they both did an equal amount of work, so you would expect to have kind of an equal amount of result. Not different based on the training style, which is, it's kind of neat to see that you could train completely different ways and get the same result. I kind of like it that way. It's always nice to be able to cater the workouts to what your athletes want. So from time period 1 to time period 3, we see a decrease in body fat for all groups, right? From time period 1 to 3, we see some changes in the size of the chest circumference, a little bit different in the undulating groups compared to the linear group, but not significantly different. The thigh circumference, pretty similar changes. Again, we see some growth. Then we come over to the strength numbers. Again, we see some pretty similar increases in upper body strength, right around 25%, except for the daily undulating group, which wasn't far behind at 17%. And we see the leg strength. We see some very large increases for linear and weekly undulating, and then still a pretty sizable amount for daily undulating. It's less, and we see more changes happening in the first from time period 1 to time period 2 for some of the studies, and more of the changes happening in time period 2 to 3 for some of the different models. So maybe that's something that needs to be considered when you are designing a program. What's my time frame? Which model works fastest? Which model do I need to work slowly and progressively over time? Are we working, again, this is where you can start considering trained versus untrained populations and athletes versus general populations. And then we see some changes in the rate of perceived exertion, but I didn't cover that. That is a way to auto-regulate your athletes, and I don't want to over-confuse you right now because that's a whole nother piece of wood to throw in the fire. So we'll visit that on another day. Then the next study I wanted to bust out for you guys was a study by Painter et al. Comparing a daily undulating to a block periodization model. This study went 10 weeks. It's just one step further than the last study, so I thought it was close enough. And if you go through the isometric peak force and back squat changes, very similar. Again, we did see increases in both groups, even when you look at the values relative to body mass, right? So we could look at gains in absolute strength versus relative strength. Still pretty similar, showing that both groups were efficacious in producing strength results. But where I want you to start transitioning your mind now is from the last study to this study, we're looking at general population people that were trained. And in this study, we're looking at track and field athletes. Now, with athletes, we have to remember that they have multiple modalities to visit per day. They're working on their special events in track. They need to do their strength training. They need to do conditioning. They need to do rehabilitation. And there's multiple modalities that go into the strength training as well. So I want you to start thinking about the concept of efficiency or less. Got confused on myself here. The ability to do less repetitions equaling the same amount of the same in your goals. That might be a concept that we need to start visiting here. And I think everybody's mind's already there because we've been talking about blood flow restriction, we've been talking about electrostimulation, high intensity training, and seeing similar results with these things compared to continuous exercise models, which shows that there are more efficient methods out there. My question of efficiency, though, comes from the programming perspective. Now let's look at table 5 over here on the left side of the slide, and you're going to see that as the weeks progress, the amount of volume that each group has to do starts becoming significantly different. And that by the time we reach the end of the study, we see almost 100,000 repetition difference in the daily undulating group compared to the block group, but we saw the same results. I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, we're going to take this and we're going to transition further into velocity-based training because I think that's another very efficient style of training. So just real quick, let's do some definitions. Velocity-based training is a method of resistance training that allows objective and accurate prescription for resistance training intensities and volumes. So for example, instead of giving somebody a 80% for 5 sets of 5, you might say, I expect you to hit 1 meter per second, and if you dip below 1 meter per second, your set is over. So you may get 3 reps in, you may get 5 reps in, but we're going to do 5 sets at that velocity. Typically what you see this used in the research is for fatigue management, right? They might come in, do an auto-regulatory check on the individual to see where their max is for the day, testing and predicting maxes. Also, this seems to be the new method for possibly getting away from 1RMs, which we know could be an injury risk. And then just for general programming, like I tried to explain, I might throw a prescription at you in the form of a velocity, not a speed, sorry, instead of a percentage and some volume. So over on the right side, I just wanted to give you guys some basic examples of what they're starting to see with maximums with the velocity. So for the bench press, they're seeing that individuals typically achieve a 1RM at about 0.17 meters per second. For the squat, we see at about 0.3 meters per second. And for the deadlift at about 0.15 meters per second, we see a 1RM. What this allows for people to do is take a velocity measurement at a lower intensity and use regression equations to predict what somebody's maximums are without having to go to a 1 repetition maximum. Which leads us into our final study that we're going to briefly break down for you all. I tried to leave a little bit of open-endedness for some of these studies so you still have somewhat of a reason to read them. But what we have in this final study is Doral et al. Comparing, I believe it was 6 weeks of training for prescribing velocity versus prescribing percentages. And again, we're going to end up in a similar situation to what we did with block versus daily undulating. If you see over on the left-hand side, we have a comparison of the volumes. And the volume is significantly different in some areas for some of the movements, and then somewhat similar, for example, in the deadlift. But still, we had the opportunity to do less work and get the same results, because if you shift over here to table 2, what you're going to see are the pre and post numbers with the effect sizes. And we see similar increases pre to post for all the movements for VBT compared with traditional percentage-based, but we see larger effect sizes coming out of the VBT. And the one that I want you to focus most on is the fact that we increased counter movement jump in the VBT group rather than in the PBT group, right? Starting to meet that demand for specificity. Okay, so when you take off for your discussion, here are some things that I want you to ponder. You'll see these same questions, but I want to break them down for you just a little bit more, just in case. Well, I want you guys to be able to identify the differences between linear and nonlinear periodization, or just simply define them, right? What do we say are our 2 staple kind of figures for linear, which is that decrease in volume, increase in intensity. What are we doing with nonlinear? It's multiple motor abilities are being trained over the course of a season, so you have multiple peaks, you have multiple days where you're hitting different focuses, different volumes, different intensities. Just be able to lay some of that out a little bit. I want you to talk a little bit about which periodization style has the greatest effect. If you're writing specifically to me, I want to hear which one has the greatest effect on strength. But I'm also open to hearing what you have to say about which one has the greatest effect on aerobic ability or power output. Or even, like I mentioned, we've been on this concept of efficiency for the last 3 weeks. What is the most efficient method to train? Maybe that's what you choose to address there. You choose to go in and compare volumes and say, hey, based on efficiency, I can get the same results with block periodization or VBT. That's my main method compared to linear and undulating. Then I want you to briefly break down the differences in individual responses to periodization. And I want you to talk about 2 main groups, right? So what is the difference between trained and untrained? And then I want you to say what's the difference between athletes and general populations. And when I say trained and untrained, I mean like sedentary people, and then people who are recreational athletes, like students that they pull in that have been in weight room classes for 4 weeks or so, And then athletes, try to take that athlete paper that I posed for you on the block periodization paper and see if you can find a similar general populations block periodization paper and see if there's any difference. Maybe there's not a difference. And then the last question, this is the one I want you to focus on the most. I want you to tell me, where does velocity-based training best fit into the structure of program design? And where's it going to have the largest impact on our clients? Again, if you're writing to me, I'm talking about athletes because I do work predominantly with athletes. But if you want to take a clinical approach to this, I'm extremely open to that. You want to talk about kids in K through 12 PE programs and how it works for that, I love that too. But I really want you to challenge that question. I love periodization and program design. It's my baby. It's my focus. But if you think we can get rid of it because we have simple prescriptions for VBT, and that's going to allow us to eliminate testing periods, and it's going to be our number one basis for fatigue management, as well as it gives us all the mechanical feedback that we need, so we don't need a lot of coaching, verbal feedback. Hey, say it. Throw a little research in there, and I'm willing to consider it for a study. Other than that, here's my list of sources. I just want to thank you all for listening to me today. It's been wonderful, and it's a privilege, and I look forward to hearing from you this week. So have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.